Gavin Newsom leaned back in his chair at the entrepreneurship panel and flashed that Hollywood smile as he called Vivek Ramaswamy an out-of-touch billionaire who doesn't understand California's innovation success. Newsom's Silicon Valley audience nodded approvingly, thinking their governor had delivered the perfect takedown. But what Newsom didn't know was that Vivek had researched every business that fled California under his leadership. Vivek's response about California's business exodus and Newsom's French Laundry hypocrisy would completely destroy his credibility and expose the ultimate failed politician. The Stanford University auditorium was packed with Silicon Valley's elite on this crisp October morning. The annual Innovation and Entrepreneurship Summit had drawn hundreds of tech executives, venture capitalists, and startup founders to hear from prominent figures about the future of American business and innovation. The prestigious venue, with its modern architecture and cutting-edge technology, seemed like the perfect backdrop for a discussion about entrepreneurship and economic policy. The panel was titled "The Future of American Innovation: Challenges and Opportunities," and featured several high-profile speakers discussing everything from regulatory frameworks to venture capital trends. Among the panelists were successful entrepreneurs, policy experts, and politicians who claimed to understand the needs of the business community. Gavin Newsom sat confidently at the panel table, his perfectly styled hair and expensive suit projecting the image of a successful politician who understood the tech industry. As California's governor, he had positioned himself as a champion of innovation and a defender of Silicon Valley's interests against what he portrayed as backward-thinking conservative policies. Newsom's political brand was built on California exceptionalism, the idea that his state was leading the nation in innovation, environmental policy, and social progress. He regularly touted California's GDP, its tech companies, and its supposed leadership in addressing complex challenges like climate change and inequality. Across the table sat Vivek Ramaswamy, the young entrepreneur and former presidential candidate who had built his reputation on challenging conventional wisdom and taking on establishment politicians. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, Vivek carried himself with the confidence of someone who had actually built successful companies from scratch, not just talked about supporting them. Vivek's background was impressive by any measure. He had founded a successful pharmaceutical company, written best-selling books about corporate America, and built a fortune through actual business success rather than political connections. His Harvard law degree and entrepreneurial experience gave him credibility that few politicians could match. The panel discussion had been proceeding smoothly, with various speakers offering their perspectives on innovation policy and economic growth. The conversation had touched on everything from tax policy to regulatory reform, with most panelists offering predictable talking points about supporting entrepreneurship and fostering innovation. That's when Newsom decided to make his move. He had been waiting for the right moment to deploy his signature political attack, and he sensed an opportunity when the discussion turned to the role of government in supporting or hindering business development. I think we need to be honest about what we're seeing in the political discourse around business and innovation, Newsom began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of California superiority that had made him a favorite among progressive activists. We have politicians and pundits who claim to understand business, but who are fundamentally out of touch with what it takes to build successful companies in the modern economy. The setup was classic Newsom, positioning himself as the authentic voice of business interests while preparing to attack those who disagreed with his policies. The audience, filled with Silicon Valley executives who had grown wealthy under California's tech-friendly policies, leaned forward with interest. We're seeing a lot of rhetoric about regulation and taxation that ignores the reality of how innovation actually happens, Newsom continued, his voice growing more pointed. We're hearing from people who have never built a company, never managed a team, never taken the risks that real entrepreneurs take every day. The attack was becoming more personal, and everyone in the auditorium could sense that Newsom was building toward a specific target. This wasn't going to be a general policy critique. This was going to be a directed assault designed to embarrass someone specific. And frankly, Newsom said, his gaze settling on Vivek, I'm concerned about the influence of people who may have made money, but who don't understand the ecosystem that makes innovation possible. People who may be wealthy, but who are fundamentally out of touch with the challenges that real entrepreneurs face. The audience murmured with anticipation, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. Newsom was clearly preparing to make Vivek the target of his attack, and the Silicon Valley crowd was ready to see their governor take down someone they viewed as a political outsider. "Vivek," Newsom said, leaning forward with that Hollywood smile that had made him famous, "you've made a lot of money, and I respect that. But I have to ask you, do you really understand California's innovation success? Do you understand what it takes to build the kind of ecosystem that has made Silicon Valley the envy of the world?" The question was loaded with condescension, implying that Vivek's success was somehow less legitimate than the success of California's tech industry. Newsom was positioning himself as the defender of real innovation against someone he portrayed as a wealthy but disconnected outsider. "Because from where I sit," Newsom continued, his voice rising with confidence, "you're an out-of-touch billionaire who doesn't understand the collaborative approach that has made California the innovation capital of the world. You don't understand the public-private partnerships, the university research systems, the regulatory frameworks that support cutting-edge development." The attack was direct and personal, designed to paint Vivek as someone whose wealth had isolated him from the realities of business development. Newsom sat back in his chair with satisfaction, clearly expecting his Silicon Valley audience to applaud his defense of California's innovation ecosystem. But what Newsom didn't realize was that he had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed that his position as California's governor and his friendly relationship with tech executives would be enough to intimidate someone he clearly viewed as a political interloper. He had no idea that he was about to confront someone who had done extensive research on California's business climate and Newsom's own record of policy failures. "Gavin," Vivek said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the auditorium pay attention, "I appreciate your confidence in California's innovation ecosystem. I really do. But I have to ask you something, and I think this audience of entrepreneurs and investors deserves to hear your answer." The tone of the conversation was shifting, and Newsom's confident expression began to falter slightly. He had expected Vivek to become defensive about his wealth or to offer some weak justification for his positions. Instead, Vivek was turning the tables and going on the offensive. "You just called me an out-of-touch billionaire who doesn't understand innovation," Vivek continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You suggested that my success somehow disqualifies me from understanding how businesses actually operate. You positioned yourself as the defender of California's entrepreneurial ecosystem." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you, Gavin, if California's innovation ecosystem is so successful under your leadership, why are businesses leaving your state in record numbers?" The question hit the auditorium like a thunderbolt, and the audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how these panels usually went. Politicians were supposed to make their attacks and receive polite applause, not face direct challenges backed by data. "Because when I look at the actual numbers," Vivek continued, his voice carrying across the auditorium with unmistakable authority, "I see a very different picture than the one you're painting. I see a state that's hemorrhaging businesses, losing population, and driving away the very entrepreneurs you claim to support." He pulled out a document from his folder, and the gesture was both theatrical and ominous. "Let me share some facts with this audience of business leaders. In 2023 alone, over 350 companies relocated their headquarters out of California. That's not my opinion, Gavin. That's data from the California Business Roundtable." The auditorium was dead silent now, the atmosphere completely transformed from celebration to shocked attention. Newsom sat rigid in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized where this was heading. "Tesla moved to Texas," Vivek continued, consulting his notes. "Oracle moved to Texas. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise moved to Texas. Charles Schwab moved to Texas. CBRE moved to Texas. These aren't small startups making emotional decisions, Gavin. These are Fortune 500 companies with teams of analysts who study exactly the kind of business climate you're supposed to be creating." The list was devastating, and everyone in the auditorium could feel the energy completely shift. The audience that had been ready to cheer Newsom's attack on Vivek was now sitting in stunned silence, confronted with evidence of California's business exodus. But it's not just the big companies, Vivek said, his voice rising with conviction. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, California lost over 340,000 residents in 2022. That's the largest population loss in the state's history. People aren't just leaving California, Gavin. They're fleeing it. The population data was particularly damaging because it showed that Newsom's failures weren't just affecting businesses, but ordinary families who couldn't afford to live in California anymore. So when you call me out of touch, Vivek continued, his voice taking on a tone of genuine incredulity, I have to ask, what's more out of touch? Understanding why businesses are leaving California or pretending that they're not leaving at all? The question was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental disconnect between Newsom's rhetoric and observable reality. How could someone claim to understand innovation while presiding over the largest business exodus in California's history? And let's talk about the reasons why these businesses are leaving, Vivek said, pulling out another document. California's corporate tax rate, 8.84%. Texas corporate tax rate, 0. California's regulatory compliance costs for businesses, an average of $134,000 per year. Texas, a fraction of that. The data was flowing now, and each statistic was like a hammer blow to Newsom's credibility. These weren't political talking points. These were the actual numbers that drove business decisions. California's gas prices, $5.50 per gallon. Texas gas prices, $3.20 per gallon. California's electricity costs, 50% above the national average. Texas electricity costs, 20% below the national average. The audience was shifting uncomfortably now, many clearly recognizing the economic realities that Vivek was describing. These were the costs that affected their own businesses, their own operations, their own bottom lines. But here's what really exposes your disconnect from reality, Gavin, Vivek said, his voice becoming more pointed. While you've been talking about California's innovation success, I've been talking to the entrepreneurs who are actually leaving. And you know what they tell me? He looked directly at Newsom, whose face had gone pale. They tell me that California's government doesn't support innovation. It strangles it. They tell me that the regulatory environment is hostile to business development. They tell me that the tax burden makes it impossible to compete with other states. The testimonial evidence was particularly powerful because it came from the very entrepreneurs that Newsom claimed to represent. How could he argue with the people who were actually making the decisions to leave? And let's talk about your personal understanding of the struggles that California families face, Vivek continued, his momentum building. Let's talk about the French Laundry incident, where you violated your own COVID lockdown orders to have dinner at one of California's most expensive restaurants. The auditorium was completely silent now, everyone recognizing the infamous scandal that had damaged Newsom's credibility throughout the pandemic. The hypocrisy was stark and undeniable. While you were telling California families that they couldn't gather for holidays, that they couldn't see their loved ones, that they couldn't operate their businesses, you were dining at a restaurant that charges $450 per person for dinner, Vivek said, his voice rising with indignation. The details of the scandal were particularly damaging because they highlighted the elite privilege that separated Newsom from the people he governed. How could someone who lived such a privileged lifestyle claim to understand the struggles of ordinary entrepreneurs? That's not just hypocrisy, Gavin, Vivek continued. That's a fundamental disconnect from the reality that most Californians face. That's the behavior of someone who is truly out of touch with the people he's supposed to serve. The attack was devastating because it turned Newsom's own accusation against him. Who was really out of touch? The entrepreneur who had built successful companies, or the politician who violated his own rules to dine at exclusive restaurants? But let's talk about the most visible sign of your policy failures, Vivek said, pulling out what appeared to be his most damaging evidence. Let's talk about the homeless crisis that has turned California's major cities into international embarrassments. The shift to homelessness was particularly powerful because it was the most visible manifestation of California's policy failures. No amount of spin could hide the reality that anyone could see by walking through San Francisco or Los Angeles. California has 12% of the U.S. population, but 30% of the nation's homeless population, Vivek said, consulting his document. Los Angeles alone has over 75,000 homeless people. San Francisco has human feces maps to help residents avoid stepping in waste on the sidewalks. The statistics were shocking, and they painted a picture of a state that had completely failed to address basic quality of life issues despite having the nation's highest taxes and most extensive social programs. You've spent over $20 billion on homeless programs in the last 5 years, Vivek continued, and the problem has gotten worse, not better. That's not innovation, Gavin. That's incompetence. The financial data was particularly damaging because it showed that Newsom's approach wasn't just ineffective. It was extraordinarily expensive. How could someone who had wasted billions of dollars on failed programs credibly lecture others about business efficiency? And let's talk about your energy policies, Vivek said, his voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. You've mandated that California transition to renewable energy, but you haven't built the infrastructure to support it. The result? Rolling blackouts, the highest electricity prices in the nation, and an electrical grid that can't handle basic demand. The energy failures were particularly relevant to the tech audience because they directly affected business operations. How could companies innovate when they couldn't rely on basic electrical service? You've banned gas-powered vehicles starting in 2035, but you've asked people not to charge their electric cars because the grid can't handle the load, Vivek continued. That's not forward-thinking policy, Gavin. That's ideological fantasy divorced from engineering reality. The contradiction between environmental mandates and practical capacity was stark and undeniable. Newsom was demanding outcomes that his own policies made impossible to achieve. So when you call me out of touch, Vivek said, his voice reaching a crescendo, I have to ask, what's more out of touch? Understanding the basic economics that drive business decisions, or pretending that businesses will stay in a state that makes it impossible for them to succeed. The question was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental absurdity of Newsom's position. How could someone who had created the conditions that drove businesses away claim to understand business better than someone who had actually built successful companies? You talk about California's innovation ecosystem, Vivek continued. But you've created an environment where innovation is punished, where success is penalized, where entrepreneurs are treated like criminals for trying to build something meaningful. The broader critique of California's business climate was particularly powerful because it resonated with the experiences of many in the audience who had struggled with the state's regulatory environment. And you know what I find most insulting about your approach? Vivek asked, his voice taking on a more personal tone. You've never built a company. You've never met payroll. You've never taken the personal financial risk that every entrepreneur in this room has taken. The distinction between political rhetoric and business reality was becoming clear, and it exposed the fundamental illegitimacy of Newsom's claims to understand entrepreneurship. Your entire career has been in politics, Vivek continued. You've never created a single job in the private sector. You've never developed a product that people wanted to buy. You've never competed in a market where failure meant losing your own money. The attack on Newsom's lack of business experience was particularly effective because it highlighted how disconnected he was from the actual process of building companies and creating value. Yet you feel qualified to lecture entrepreneurs about innovation, Vivek said, his voice growing stronger. You feel entitled to judge business decisions, to criticize business leaders, to determine what's best for industries you've never participated in. The auditorium was completely captivated now, everyone recognizing the fundamental truth of Vivek's argument. How could someone with no business experience credibly claim to understand business better than people who had actually built successful companies? Let me tell you what real innovation looks like, Vivek continued, his voice reflecting both knowledge and passion. Real innovation happens when entrepreneurs are free to take risks, when they can keep the rewards of their success, when government creates a stable environment that supports business development rather than hindering it. The contrast between Vivek's understanding of innovation and Newsom's regulatory approach was becoming clear, and it highlighted the fundamental difference between supporting business and controlling it. Real innovation happens in states like Texas and Florida, where businesses can operate without navigating Byzantine regulatory frameworks, Vivek said. It happens in places where entrepreneurs can focus on creating value rather than managing compliance costs. The comparison to other states was particularly damaging because it showed that innovation was thriving in places that had rejected California's regulatory model. And you know what's really tragic about California's decline? Vivek asked, his voice taking on a tone of genuine sadness. California has everything it needs to be successful. It has great universities, talented people, natural resources, and a history of innovation. But it has a government that treats success as a problem to be solved rather than an achievement to be celebrated. The recognition of California's inherent advantages made its failures even more damaging to Newsom's credibility. How could someone preside over the decline of a state with so many natural advantages? So Gavin, Vivek said, beginning to gather his papers, the next time you want to call someone out of touch, maybe you should explain why businesses are fleeing your state. The next time you want to lecture someone about innovation, maybe you should explain why entrepreneurs can't succeed under your policies. He stood up, preparing to leave the panel, but he wasn't finished. And the next time you want to criticize someone's understanding of business, maybe you should try building one yourself instead of just taxing and regulating the people who do. His final words would echo in that auditorium long after the panel was over. I'll keep building companies, creating jobs, and supporting the entrepreneurs who actually drive innovation. You can keep pretending that government knows better than markets, that regulation drives innovation, and that businesses leave successful states. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Newsom sat motionless in his chair, his political authority completely destroyed by the weight of evidence about California's business exodus and his own policy failures. His Hollywood smile and confident rhetoric had been turned against him, revealing the hollow core of his political brand. The audience sat in stunned silence, many clearly recognizing the truth of Vivek's arguments in their own business experiences. The other panelists looked around uncertainly, unsure how to respond to such a devastating exposure of California's failures. The confrontation between Vivek Ramaswamy and Gavin Newsom had exposed something crucial about American politics: the fundamental disconnect between political rhetoric and economic reality. It had highlighted the danger of allowing career politicians to pose as business experts while implementing policies that drove businesses away. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the political authority in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that results mattered more than rhetoric, that business success required understanding markets rather than controlling them, and that the American people deserved leaders who created opportunities rather than destroying them. The age of unquestioned political authority over business was over. The age of demanding results from economic policies had begun. And it had started with an entrepreneur from Ohio who had the courage to challenge a failed governor from California with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about what actually worked.